Hi, I'm Dave Cut, and you're watching another Comic Chat. What's up, guys? Back again today with the third and final part of Spider-Man Black and Black. With the first part we went through, we saw Aunt May actually getting shot, put in the hospital into a coma, and Spider-Man going out and finding out that Kingpin was actually the person who put the hit on her and taking care of him. And the second part, we saw Spider-Man teaming up with Sandman and trying to help free his father from this wrongful accusation that he murdered Uncle Ben, but it turned out to be the chameleon from the future and all of this. So we're here with the third and final edition where we get to finally find out what's going on with this Arrow, this Miss Arrow. So as you can see, this is the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man number 20. So it starts out with Miss Arrow in a church talking to what seems to be a giant spider, and it telling her that, you must reproduce soon if you are to survive. And her kind of saying like, don't worry, I've already found the perfect host, and her host is Flash Thompson, and he shall be her mate and her host, and after that, her sustenance. So yeah, Flash is in trouble. I mean, she seems pretty crazy. So we cut to Spider-Man kind of checking on Aunt May in the hospital with MJ there, and him kind of regretting, unmasking and becoming this villain, and now everybody knows who he is, and kind of wishing he just didn't do all of that. But he gets interrupted by someone in the building and gets shooed away because they're probably going to call the cops on him, and he is a criminal now. So we flash to 327 9th Avenue, apartment 4, where Flash Thompson stays, and where Peter's actually staying there with them. And Betty Brant actually shows up there, not knowing who Peter is in disguise, but it doesn't take her very long to realize and figure out that, it's Peter, since all his stuff is there, and um she's a reporter and he's just not very good at hiding it. So yeah, he finally admits that, he's Peter Parker, and then she starts giving him her condolences and all that since she heard about what happened, and they kind of get to start to get to talking. And then we see Flash Thompson getting taken to the bowling alley from his friend Kelly, kind of bringing her along to show up some other guys, because he coaches a high school bowling team there. And then we see Miss Arrow show up, and she's like, wow, another woman, I have to chop down, but she gets stomach pain, and she's starting to see like, oh, her overseer wasn't kidding, that she needs to move things along a little bit faster before jumping down and saying, when nature calls, answer the phone. Then we cut to Peter and Betty talking in Flash's apartment, and her kind of giving him the rundown of, you know, this Arrow chick, and if there's any, pool to it, does he believe her or not? And he says, yeah, because like there's been some interesting stuff that goes on at that school. The principal died, a shape-shifting villain from the 23rd century told him. Like, yeah, which we saw in the old one, it was Chameleon. And then he recounts odd interaction he had with Arrow when she barges into Flash's office while they were talking, and kind of putting the moves on Flash and him taking the bait. But the weird thing about it was that Peter's spider sense never went off. He says it was like my inner eye was blind to her, and something was kind of fishy, and that they should probably look into this. So they actually end up Googling her, finding out seeing if they can find anything on this Arrow and Spider search, but instead they get, a Google correction saying, "Did you mean Spider Arrow?" And that just clicks for Peter, and he remembers that he actually fought a Spider Arrow, you know, the pirate spiders, you know. They are also called the cannibal spider since they feed on other spiders, the spiders of the genus Eero. It even says which Eero, sounds a lot like they never finish it, but it's pretty much Arrow. So we cut to Arrow, Miss Arrow actually showing up to the alley and talking to Flash, being like, "I'm ready to have our date right now." But he's already in the middle of, playing with these high school kids that he's keep coaching, and he already brought a friend. So when he goes up to introduce them, Kelly and Miss Arrow gives her such a cold response, like charms Flash, "Let's go." And Kelly's trying to tell him, like, you can't leave. You brought me here. You can't just leave yet. And she's like, "Yes, I can." Arrow's like putting her foot down, and Kelly's not budging and she's not budging, and then Arrow finally just pushes her, shoves Kelly. Then you see Flash kind of being worried for his friend and then being like, "You're crazy. Why did you just attack my friend?" And she trying to rush him out of there since she's kind of running out of room, or out of time. But Kelly gets back up and she actually hits Miss Arrow with the bowling pin, which sets her off, and she just ends up throwing up thousands of spiders on Kelly. And then Spider-Man crashes through the window, kind of saying, "Arrow, I know who you are now." And her just kind of giving up the act, saying, "I'm your nemesis, your opposite number. You can't get rid of me that easily." And then just kind of disappears. And then we can see Flash Thompson and Kelly running away in her pickup truck, but not before long because then Arrow kind of picks up the whole truck with a bunch of spiders and dumps Kelly out the wagon, and Spider-Man has to save her, but he's just a little too late to save Flash, and Miss Arrow actually ends up taking him. Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, number 21. So it starts out with Spider-Man trying to concentrate on his spider sense, trying to track, where Arrow went so he can save Flash. But this cop shows up and actually tries arresting him, and Spider-Man just kind of takes his gun away, and Betty ends up calling him, trying to find out if Flash is okay. Spider-Man actually ends up telling her what happened and that Arrow is actually made up of thousands of spiders and that she should stay away to be safe. But as you can see, the cop kind of going back to his car, getting even more weapons and coming back, and Spider-Man having to take him and break him before trying to plead with this cop, telling him, he wouldn't give up the good fight, how Captain America actually is the one that gave up. He wound up on a slab. And, what did the cop have to say to that? And the cop just saying, "You're under arrest." And Spider-Man swinging away, just kind of saying, "I give up." And we can see somebody had actually recorded that whole interaction. All right. Then we see Flash waking up, stuck to a ceiling as Arrow dangles below him. As he screams and calls her a monster, she says the only monster is Spider-Man. And then her stomach actually starts hurting and she ends up falling to the ground. Flash kind of thinking she was going to break her neck. She kind of digs into her abdomen before pulling out this egg sac and pointing to Flash and saying, "That's your daddy." And Flash kind of freaking out. And you can see her telling him, "This egg sac is going to go down your throat." And then she kind of tells him, like what exactly is about to happen to him, how his tantric energy will go into her and she'll siphon it back into him you know, and then they'll be one, but the spiders will eat him away and his spirit will live on in them. But Flash still, he's not going to open his mouth. And Spider-Man actually ends up catching up and intervening just in the nick of time before Arrow kind of just charges at him with spikes drawn. As Spider-Man pops out spikes too, and they start to fight. Then we can see Jonah Jameson and Robbie Robertson at the Daily Bugle seeing that video that was taken of Spider-Man and that police officer. And you can see Jonah kind of wanted making it a story, and Robbie kind of saying, hey, we should cut this kid a break. He's had enough. He's unmasked, he's on the run, his aunt's hospitalized, Captain America is dead, for crying out loud. And Jonah's kind of responsible for it all. And he's shocked to hear that, but Robbie kind of tells him, it's true too, because he's been the one, you know, pitting the entire community against people like Spider-Man, this entire time, slandering his name. And Robbie trying to reason with him, you're like, this used to be a coworker of ours, dare he say a friend. And after all that, Robbie storms out saying, you can do whatever you want since, you're the boss after all. So we come back to Spider-Man talking about how he's glad that the Stingers came back, and Arrow telling him that of course they came out. You know, she even tells him they only come out when you face someone like me, someone whose being is rooted in primal forces of chaos and darkness. She even goes further and says, I am the female to your male, dark skinned to your light, strength to your weakness. And Spider Man even says, don't forget chunky to my creamy. So he's always a little quick witted with it. He then even gets her with a good strike, but it goes right through her. And she counters with a good strike of her own. And she even tells him, this poison in my sting would kill anyone else, but you, it would simply slow down before knocking him back as he falls. Then she tells Flash that although she could have had thousands of children with him as a host, with Spider-Man as a host, at least she would only have a few hundred, but she wouldn't have to deal with Spider-Man anymore. So as she opens up his mask, she's about to put the egg sac in there. She says, "Here comes the choo-choo." Then we see Robbie going into Jonah's office where Jonah kind of just tells him, "Hey, you're fired. Get the hell out of the building. Close the door." You know, Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man number 22. Here we start off with Robbie coming home to his wife early and her kind of freaking out because he's here early, and we all know why he's home early because he had just been fired. But when she hears that, she doesn't freak out. She kind of just starts laughing hysterically and saying, when she could think of all the horrible things that it could have been, this wasn't really one of them. That Jonah has actually been a cancer on Robbie's life, probably taking some years off of his life as it is already. And then his son comes down and also freaks out. Why is his dad home early? And he has to tell him as well that he had just got fired. But his son actually blames Peter Parker for him being fired and saying, it's just unfair that Peter Parker should cost you your job. And Robbie kind of just being like, Peter, it wasn't his fault. And his son just saying, it sure is. If he never unmasked, none of this would have happened. This is on his head. Predator, prey. And this, you can see, Arrow is about to shove that egg sac down Peter's throat. But just as she is about to, blam! The egg sac gets shot out of her hand. And just before she can realize what's exactly going on, blam! Another shot goes straight through her chest. And we can see it's actually Betty Brant standing there with the shotgun saying right back at you before firing another one. Blam! And another one. Blam! And another one. Blam! Saying this is for threatening Peter and Flash. And this is for making me afraid of toilets before. Blam! Firing another shot. As the arrow is falling back, Peter's noticing that Betty's actually doing damage on her and asks, like, what is she using? And Betty telling him she's using silver bullets with crosses in them. You know, she figured that the opposite of unholy might work, so she grabbed them while she was at home. And Peter kind of like surprised that she has silver bullets. And she's saying, I'm a reporter for the Daily Bugle. I've seen stuff that would freak out a Kolchak. And as Arrow's falling back, she's threatening Betty, saying, prepare to sleep with that thing under your pillow. In fact, prepare not to sleep at all because I'll be watching, waiting. And as soon as you choose to close your eyes, you'll have spiders under your eyelids, up your nose, down your throat. And when you try to scream, you'll just vomit up spiders right before she escapes. And Spider Man even saying, we got to end this tonight. She doesn't get to get away after that speech. But Betty's kind of concerned about Spider Man since he had just, gotten stabbed and got that venom in him that paralyzed him. And she already had to come save him. So she's like, hey, take the shotgun. But we know Spider Man doesn't use shotguns. So he tells her to keep it in case, Arrow comes back. She would at least have protection. Okay, so up on the roof, we see Arrow making a paraglider out of a bunch of spiders before Spider Man actually catches up to her. He grabs her in the nick of time but gets gusted away. And as they're flying through the city, she makes these kind of uncalled for remarks taunting Spider Man, saying, your death would have been inevitable, but you would have had more time with your loved ones. Maybe even been around long enough to bid goodbye to your frail old auntie. Ooh, strike a nerve. Hate coping with the knowledge that you kill whatever you love. And we know from this book that Spider Man does not play around about this situation, and he immediately catches up to her before cutting off her strings to the paraglider and they free fall. And Spider Man's actually able to get over her and slam her into the ground. Before swinging away, he says, you've lost, Arrow. You're dead. You just don't know it yet. You gave me the clue yourself. With all your talk about predators, made me think about yours. And when I saw where we were flying over, and her not knowing what's going on and not understanding yet as we see a bird kind of fly over to her, he says, we're at the Central Park Zoo, specifically the aviary. And we see birds start to flock to her. And even more birds as Peter's kind of telling her to go back to hell and stay there before hundreds of birds flock all over her body and are gone in an instant, leaving but only one spider that Spider Man crushes. So back at Flash's apartment where Peter's staying, Betty's there trying to get a hold of the Daily Bugle to tell them, what just happened. But she actually finds out that Jonah had fired Robbie, and she fired Robbie because of Peter. And Peter takes this to heart and says, like hell, I'm getting showered and changed, and then Jonah Jameson and I are going to have a long overdue chat. Friendly Neighborhood Spider Man, number 23. And this is the final part. Starts out in Brooklyn, New York, where Jonah Jameson is knocking on Robbie's door, and his son answers, and he sees that Jonah actually has two black eyes and looks pretty beat up, his hands wrapped up and everything, but he just tells him he ran into a door and that he's here to talk to Robbie. So they invite him in, and Robbie agrees to talk with them, and even the son kind of threatens him, saying like if anything happens to his dad, they have lots of doors around here that he can run into, kind of threatening him. But Robbie does sit down and talk with him, and Jonah starts to tell him the story of what happened. And it starts out with him at the Daily Bugle talking to Betty Brant, while she begs him to rehire Robbie, and him saying, I'm not going to do it. And as he gets to his office, you see that Spider Man actually webbed up a nice little note for him, telling him to meet him at this location at night. So, when Jonah shows up to this location, before he even gets in the door, Spider Man strings him up by the chest and pulls him through. And he's like, yeah, we need to have a talk. And you can see he kind of is just telling him, like, hey, you need to rehire Robbie. There's been a lot of stuff that you've done that you can't undo, but at least this you can undo. And Jonah's not really going for it, saying that he's seen, like, what's happened to Peter and then how he's not actually saving the world. And Peter's like, you can at least say thank you. And he's like, thank you. And Peter says, see, that wasn't so hard. And he's like, why should I thank you? And Peter kind of breaks it down for him. He's like, for boosting your circulation with all the pictures I sold you for starters. Then they're saving your son, for saving you, for saving the world. And Jonah just kind of saying, like, how about your uncle and your aunt? How about George Stacy and his daughter? How did saving them work out for you? Kind of giving some low blows if you guys know what happened with them. And him even saying, you can even see Jonah saying, like, oh, I'm sorry, that was uncalled for. And Spider-Man kind of flipping out, like, what do you talk uncalled for? After everything that he's done, after everything he's put Spider-Man through, there's an actual boundary that's uncalled for him. And Jonah kind of just blowing up on him, saying like that was editorials and stuff like that. And Spider-Man just going back and forth with him before Jonah finally just gives him an ultimatum. He's just like, I can drop the lawsuit I have against you, or I can rehire Robbie. And without hesitation, Spider-Man says, drop the lawsuit. And with a surprised look, you can see Jonah saying, like, really? Really? And then finally being like, aha, I knew it. Saying that he knew that Spider-Man would, use his powers for his own personal gain and all that other stuff. And, Spider-Man just said, I did that to see your reaction. And you look surprised because deep down, he is truly an unselfish person. And he was like, so did it work? Are you going to rehire Robbie and all that? And Jonah's just saying, no, I still don't agree with you. The lawsuit stays and Robbie stays fired. And Spider-Man's just like, hit me. And Jonah's just like, what? So confused. And Spider-Man takes his mask off, showing that it's Peter Parker, telling Jonah that he's jealous that, he has all these powers and that he uses them to help everybody else instead of helping himself. Kind of edging him on to hit him even more, calling Jonah, gutless before slapping him real quick in the face, very lightly, but kind of edging him on and telling him like, does your son know you're gutless? Does your wife know you're gutless? He's like, oh, I'll let them know, Jonah. Yeah, I'll let them know. Let them know that the brave, crusading Daily Bugle publisher is just a gutless, craven, spineless limp. And Jonah decks him. And Spider-Man reels back. Peter even says, he's like, what, are you kidding me? Is that the best you can do? And he hits him again. And again. And as he's recapping this, he's telling Robbie, he says, I lost track of how many times I just kept hitting him, Robbie. He never fell. Not once did he even come close. He was like one of those bop 'em bags that you have as a kid. And the whole time, it was the sickest thing. He was just smiling. And finally, when my fist was throbbing and skin near to the bone, he said, "Are we done yet?" And Jonah just says, "Yeah." But Spider Man swings away, leaves him one last little present. He says he recorded the entire thing, and that's why he unmasked, so everyone would know it's him. That he could run it on the front page and he could title it, Spider Man, too afraid to lift a hand against the Crusading Bugle editor, and that he would sell a gazillion copies if he did it. But as Jonah calls out to Parker and Peter and Pete, he gets no response. So the next day, Jonah actually does the right thing, puts the film on the ground, and kind of stomps it. And then as he storms off, he actually gets whacked in the face by Betty Brant with the door, which actually causes his two black eyes. So he actually got his two black eyes from a door, but broke his hand hitting Spider Man. And without realizing it, Robbie comes to a great realization here. He kind of is like, Spider-Man needed that more than he's in turmoil. His life was falling apart. He feels completely responsible. He may not be thinking it at the time, but unconsciously, he wanted to be punished for every decision he ever made that brought death, destruction, and chaos to his loved ones. As much as you pummeled him, it was probably a fraction of what he thinks he deserves. And it's true. And he says, Robbie asks, like, was he right about, are you going to drop the lawsuit? And he says, yeah. And he says, can I come back to work? And he tells him, sure. And even Robbie kind of says, like, what if I choose not to come back to work? And he's like, I'll tell you how much I need you and I'll just give you more money before. He finds the note that Spider Man left him and thanks for the wine, you friendly neighborhood Spider Man, as he swings away and he says, I hate that. That FN Spider Man, friendly neighborhood. And next, one more day. Then there we have it, guys. That was the first Black and Black series. There's one more book, so stay tuned. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back with Peter Parker's Spider-Man, Back in Black. So till next time, guys. Have a good one.